afternoon or the evening, depending where you are from around the world. We should be able to cover most of the content in just over an hour. And if there are questions and answers that you want to pose throughout the session, please shoot them on the IM window. And if we need further clarification, we can stop and ask you guys to clarify those on voice if necessary. So the focus of the presentation is really probably the single newest module that has been added into the Microsoft System Center suite, and that is the Windows Azure Pack. So before we get off, I'll just do a quick overview or introduction. CloudOS Community, as you're aware, is a operation that we're running out of the UK and Europe to help promote the CloudOS operating system and the activities that are happening as part of Microsoft's embracement of the cloud. And the CloudOS itself is really a set of different people, including yourselves, where we share and update knowledge on different problems within the System Center environment. And we try to work together to make it better, and of course work directly with Microsoft to address some of those challenges as we come across them. So utterly community focused is where we are, and we're here to work with you guys and try and help and support as we work across the complete environment that is System Center. So how am I involved in this particular one? I work for a company called Lionbridge Technologies, 17 years with that operation, and my job is around managing and designing infrastructure and architecting the technologies that will help continue to move the company forward. Over the last number of years, probably in the region of 7 or 8 years, I've worked very, very closely with the product groups in Microsoft, starting off specifically with the Windows and Hyper-V teams, and then growing into the virtual machine management side of that world as we went from what was a physical infrastructure to a virtualized infrastructure, and then continued on that path as we moved down along the roads to introduce what our private cloud, start taking into account all of those different things that make a private cloud, and then focus on the hypervisor, which is Hyper-V today. As time has progressed, I have had the pleasure of working with a lot of different MVPs, and also becoming an MVP myself, 4th year in a row, just since the beginning of January, and also had the ability to co-author a number of books on cloud-based technologies, with the newest one just almost ready to go published, and that is around the craze of software-defined networking. So a little bit less on the marketing for me, and a little bit more about the marketing of what is the Windows Azure Pack, what we're here for, and why does it matter to us. So the CloudOS itself is really what everything has been driven from, and the Azure Pack becomes the front door to this CloudOS. What we're looking at is an ability to deliver one consistent platform. That is essentially the underlying drivers for this. And the consistent platform really means that the services that you offer, either internally or externally, to yourselves or to your customers, essentially needs to feel and work the same, no matter where that platform is. If you have that on-premise, if you are outsourcing some of that technology to providers like Rackspace or Hosting 365, or of course onto some of the public cloud services, such as, of course, Microsoft's own solution, Azure. So within that whole idea, we're basically trying to standardize the procedures around transforming the data center, making sure that what we do there is a repeatable, consistent procedure, and using technologies and standards based on SIM and OMI to make sure that everything that we do can be scripted through. So managing a switch becomes quite similar to managing a router, which in turn becomes quite similar to managing a Windows box or a Linux box. Effectively, the one set of commands will be essentially unique to the complete stack, allowing us to script and repeat those same procedures. We also need to take the interfaces that we provide to our users and simplify them, make them available on more devices, and allow those devices then to have a consistent user feel, so that our users themselves get to a point where we introduce technologies without providing huge amounts of training on how to use those technologies, because we want to get to a scenario where those apps effectively will be self-evident when the user launches and starts interacting with those. Within our own environments, we also have data, huge amounts of them. And that can be anything from syslogs that are going on in the background coming in from your network devices. They can be from your event logs sitting on Windows servers. And pretty much all of the data that drives your complete business. That data needs to be mined, and we need to be able to get into an environment where we can actually start reacting and working with the information that's available to us. And the Azure Pack actually starts us down that road where we effectively start building out a complete data warehousing module for getting out consistent information based on the services that we are going to deliver. So as we take a look at everything that we've seen so far in that Cloud OS platform and providing consistency, one of the things that we're trying to do is not only for the end user, but for us, the IT pros, to make sure that we have consistent access and consistent methodologies for querying that data that we have in the background. So people, our end users, ourselves, and our customers all have been empowered essentially to start understanding what it is they're doing and what effects that's having. So let that be from an end user using resources like a website or a SQL database or even some virtual machines, through to us as administrators. Giving that information back to the users allows them to start understanding what it is they're having an impact on in the environment, and allows us to show them what that costs in both monetary terms or in green terms, so that we can start then contemplating the theories of if we were to charge you for these services. So moving us directly into a service-driven IT environment where everything we get and do is consistent across the board. So the Azure Pack is kind of one of these things that we initially look at and try to figure out what is it and why do we really care, and how can it be all of these to everyone. And it's also one of these things that's kind of appeared out of nowhere. It really didn't exist on most radars prior to the launch of System Center 2012 R2, which really had only happened probably 3 months back. So how is it possible that something so new can be so important to the ecosystem, and how do we embrace that? And that's essentially what we're going to try and cover over the next 50 minutes or so. What it is, why we care about it, and more importantly, from an IT perspective, how it's built. What is it doing in the backgrounds that makes all of these things possible for us to do? So the truth of the matter is, it's not that new. Azure Pack is essentially a package that has taken all of the work that Microsoft have invested in over the last number of years on Azure itself. So previously, we've had a lot of experience with Microsoft building an on-premise cloud type solution. We started off with Viridian, which became Hyper-V. Hyper-V then got something like Virtual Machine Manager added to it. Virtual Machine Manager, in its first instances, got a self-service portal, which allowed us to use virtual machines like a PVR, stop, start, rewind, all of those simple things on a VM. But that really wasn't enough. We needed to have some sort of a procedures around how do we request those virtual machines? How do we request the resources? And in all essences, Microsoft's on-premise focus has really been focused on those virtual machines. We've had a number of different solutions over the years, including the Cloud Services Process Pack, Self-Service Portal version 2.0, and many other attempts from Microsoft to try and get us to a streamlined solution. But while we've been working with this in our enterprises and in our environments, there's been a second trend going on also within Microsoft, where we have the enterprise and the hosters attempting to work, and they've had the hoster service provider platforms and a few other accelerators or pieces of code or software kits essentially delivered to these guys so they could do a little bit more and potentially sell the resources they're doing. But agnostic to everything that we've been doing, there's been a different team that have been working a little bit of island on their own in Microsoft, and that's been the Azure team. And when we questioned those guys about, are you using Hyper-V in the background, we pretty much got the message back, no, it's something special. And are you using this type of portals? And no, it's something special. And everything we got back from those guys was, it's something special. And they were running a little bit of island of their own. But over the last probably 2 to 3 years, as Microsoft have become a lot more open and engaging, and also with restructures that's going on in the operations, we've learned a lot more about what's actually happening inside the environment. And now some of the truths have been coming out, and we are finding out that the latest versions of Azure include are running Hyper-V in the back end. They are running portals that are built to standards. But much more important to us, that environment is very much based on standards that are repeatable and consistent. And finally, the teams within Microsoft focusing on our enterprises and focusing on our hosters, they finally started looking over their shoulders and realizing that they're delivering far more sophisticated solutions from the Azure group than they have delivered to us from onboard solutions so far and to date. With that in mind, we had the initial release of what was known as Windows Azure Services for Windows Server, a beautiful name in all due respects from Microsoft, that was released last January. And that was essentially the very first transportation of what we are looking at today. And of the latest version from 2012 or 2, we are now calling this thing the simpler name of the Windows Azure Pack. And if we take a look at how it's built, the Azure Pack essentially is an analog to what we see happening in Windows Azure itself. The hypervisors on the bottom, in this particular case, Windows Azure, versus the hypervisors and the management suite that are sitting over in our on-premise / our hoster side, happens to be, of course, Windows Server and the System Center environment. Plus an extra additional feature known as the Service Provider Foundation. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. So what really has happened is that essentially Microsoft have taken the portals they've delivered as part of Azure, and they're allowing us now to run those on-premise. We take that same portal and deliver it to ourselves. So we get a self-service portal. But that's not enough, because behind the scenes in Azure, of course, there's somebody managing this thing, and our cloud administrators of Azure are essentially invisible. We don't see them. You might open a support case or an email case, but there's no human communication. And how they configure and deliver services is essentially black magic. Let's consider it being PowerShell or whatever the case may be. But for on-premise, we needed to deal with something a little bit more usable. So a second portal has been essentially delivered. And that second portal is delivered for us as the administrators of our clouds. That allows us to actually take the services that we have, which essentially are our virtual machine clouds, and split them into things that tenants would use. Tenants would be using things like plans and services and types of quotas within their environment. So the very first changes that's happening in the Azure Pack is essentially we get a second portal, a portal designed for the provider, or in this particular case, what we are calling the administrators. Now, under the scenes, that portal needs to communicate with something. So we begin to move into standards here. And one of the very first standards that you will be aware of at the moment is that not only do you use the web portal to talk to Azure, but you can use many other third-party tools. So if you want to upload a VHD or query a blob in SQL, there are third-party tools and Microsoft-provided tools which will allow you to talk directly to Azure and communicate and get that information in or out of the environment. Those APIs are now common. They've actually taken those APIs and brought them on premise. So essentially the toolings will be the same, and we can use essentially the very same tool sets as time progresses to do the same type queries with the environments we have on site or hosted in Microsoft. That also gives us one more benefit. Let's assume you don't like the look of the Azure portal because you happen to be running Amazon and you don't really want your system to be looking like Azure, because that really would be confusing. Then you can create your own portals. That portal can be a web portal, it can be an application, it can be a mobile device. Those can be simply web scripts or PowerShell scripts, Node.js, whatever it may be that decides. Those all communicate directly to the Service Manager API. By virtue of having that segregation in place, you now have the ability essentially on premise to customize and deliver your services. But more so, you can have that on-premise portal actually communicate with multiple APIs. So it is feasible, if you want to actually configure an application within your portal, which actually is a front end to the public Azure service. And we have to think about the fact that we have hosters, and these guys play a massive game here, where essentially the hosters are taking your services and they're trying to be part of your data center. If they also expose these APIs, then on-premise you can have that one single portal to request a website, but where that website is delivered from, you now can mask directly from your users. You can be delivering it from a hoster, from on-premise, or from, of course, up in the Azure cloud. That gives you the consistency we talk about. Now, if we think a little bit about what this is, up till now, we've only focused on things like virtual machines. That's all of the previous stuff that Microsoft have ever delivered to us in a self-service scenario is the idea of delivering a virtual machine. But as you run IT, you know that that is not enough. You need to deliver other things. If you look in your data center today, just count how many websites you're probably running, how many SQL installs, SQL instances, SQL databases, things about automating all of these technologies. Wouldn't it be great if we could get into a scenario where when somebody creates a virtual machine, the next thing I need to do is send them an email, or more importantly, if that virtual machine happens to be deployed into production, and then afterwards we get a decommission notice to say, right, time to get rid of this thing. Deleting a virtual machine is only part of that job. We have ultimately more steps to do. We need to go into our Active Directory, remove the object from AD. We might want to clean up our DNS. We may need to update our inventory systems. Service management automation is one of those extra functionalities that's been added into the Azure Pack that allows us to do exactly that. We can take the information that we have, use it, and extend it to deliver us lots more features and functionalities. So, in essence, the Cloud OS and the consistency is a leveraging of what Microsoft are delivering in Azure today and bringing on premise so that you can have the exact same experience and deliver your services as services just like the hosters do. And the best piece of all of this is as you start getting your developers to contemplate delivering product, let that be in public cloud or on private cloud, technologies like Service Bus, which were never previously available on premise, they're now available and available with the exact same interfaces that were available in the public Azure environment. So those guys can spin up their Visual Studio and they can code directly to this. And you can control as the administrator, how many buses they can use and what databases in the backend are going to be responsible for the FIFO chains that are used in those services. So before I move into taking a little look under the cover, I'll just shoot back as far as the eye in window and see, do we have any questions, or are you guys still with me?
Seem to be all right at the minute, Damian.
That's lovely, Steve, and I see you're playing a little bit of game of bingo here. Okay. All right, so let's take a closer look at what's happening in the pack itself, and let's go under the covers. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at this thing, and the very first thing that I'm going to call out is that this is not simply the Azure Pack. This is a framework. And why I call it a framework is just like everything that we've seen Microsoft deliver for developers. They have the .NET framework, and before that you had the MVC framework, and you have lots of different frameworks that are extensible. The Azure Pack that we have access today is extensible. It is documented and it is free. So you guys can go, take what you've got, use it as samples, edit it, modify it, or extend it. And that's extremely important as we go through what we're going to look at today, because Microsoft have started in the idea of taking services that they deliver in public Azure, taking those and bringing them back as extensions so that we can then plug them into the framework and turn them on. So what we look at today is going to be a set of different services that the framework delivers. You do not need to turn them all on. You can turn on one, you can turn on them all, you can turn on any combination as you so wish. So allowing you to take the basics and move up to a fully delivered service. And over time, expect that Microsoft will deliver more services, but far more importantly, expect third parties to deliver more services. You'll see things like help desk integrations going on in here. You'll see lots of third parties like billing providers, CrowdCruiser, and other third parties adding to this framework. And of course, this is ASP.NET 4.5. It is MVC and it's HTML5. It is standard Visual Studio 2012, 2013 projects. And there are open SDKs available for you to go grab and do these extensions. So if you've got something on premise that you would like to add, you can. So the first of the modules that Microsoft delivered to us is for websites. And this is kind of an interesting one because we've never done websites as self-service in the enterprise before. We've had this idea of having IIS, and then you might have DFS to copy your files between different locations. And then IIS got this thing called a web farm, which allowed us to essentially hold different pieces together. And essentially get 2 and 3 different web servers pointing at the same share, and essentially allowing us to start scaling out our websites. But ultimately, somebody was responsible. And in that scenario, you had to work with that guy to figure out, can I have a website? Can I point to a share? And then you need to work with those guys of how often they're going to update the share that essentially hosts their web stuff. And it got messy. In the Azure Pack framework, that world changes, and we now have essentially the exact same experience you would get on public Azure, where you have fully integrated version control. You have a fully self-service environment where you go in, request a website, and from there, the file shares are provisioned, the repositories for the SSL certificates are made available, or you can upload your own certificates. It's scalable. It can be just like in the public Azure, you can scale it from one node to multiple nodes and back. And of course, it supports all of the primary platforms our webs run on. So again, PHP, Node.js, .NET Framework, all of these different providers are enabled out of the box. So your life as an administrator changes drastically because you no longer need to worry about spinning up a few extra machines for every new project that comes in. You now spin up a farm and you can start splitting stuff over this farm. In addition to websites, the most obvious one is going to be virtual machines. The virtual machines that we have available to us are no longer the type of virtual machines that we had in the previous self-service portals, and not even the stuff that we had in what was essentially App Controller, but we get real virtual machine services. And when I say real virtual machine services, I really mean that we get to a point where we're no longer restricted to these PVR type solutions with a little bit of drag and drop. Instead, we now get a fully self-service environment. We can go in, we can pick from a gallery. For the first time ever, we have this ability to select that I would like to have a virtual machine that's made from CentOS or from Windows, or I would like a machine that's going to be a domain controller, and I can pick the hard disk type 2008, 2012. I can decide that this virtual machine might actually be running a business application that I packaged up. I also get access to the networks. In our previous worlds, we had this whole idea of a tenancy associated to a cloud, which really never worked. And then when we come to 2012 R2, that kind of sort of got fixed, but you were still restricted to the networks you could associate your virtual machines to. Now you can create your networks. We can talk about the software-defined network technologies that are available to us. We can rely on the existing isolation technologies like VLAN, but the user can be provisioned in his cloud with one or more networks, and he can associate his VMs. So finally, you can allow somebody to go build a cloud and have 2 networks, one for production and one for DMZ, and allow those communications to happen so they can start modeling how the real world would work. You take that a step further, and the next big one that we get is databases. Database sprawl is one of those things that drives us nuts because we've got people running SQL 2005, 2008, 2008 R2, 2012, and of course we've got the newest basis for 2014. That also gets added on top of the fact that, well, some of the people like to run things like WordPress, which really would like to run on MySQL. And again, we start building out more servers, and then it becomes an ownership, and we don't really want to share the resources or consolidate. So we're going back into a sprawl type solution. So one of the easiest, quickest, and best fixes that we're going to see in the Azure Pack is the fact that we can now take a SQL server, spin up an instance on it, hook that instance up to the Azure Pack, and then go back to our users and say, you know what, lads, I'm going to give you access. You can spin up 10, 12, 15 databases, but I'm going to restrict you so that those databases can't consume any more than 20 meg, 100 meg, whatever the restrictions are. And you get to define those things. And just like you would with GoDaddy or Bluehost or any of those guys, when that database is created, they will be handed back a connection string. That connection string can be imported back and used on the websites, or it can be ported forward and used in some of their business applications. But once more, you have a consolidated service in the back end that you can scale and monitor just like you would any professional service. But from the user's perspective, when their time is up, when they kill their subscriptions, you can clean up the mess that's left after them and delete those databases and bring things back to normal, just like you've been doing with your virtual machines and just like you're going to start doing now with your websites. You take that a step further and we add some more magic to this system and we get this whole idea of automation. And I gave some scenarios where we go to the idea of spinning up and spinning down machines. Automation gets added into this where we can do all sorts of magic running through PowerShell or calling out to Orchestrator and essentially leverage all of the functionality that exists there. So as you spin up your virtual machines, you can start taking actions based on the fact that I've requested a specific type virtual machine. So I may want to get an alert every time somebody selects a domain controller from the gallery. I can send a note saying, congratulations, you've had another user use your domain controller. Or you might need to send a message to somebody that's responsible for the federation gateway and make them aware that there's a new domain going to come online. Or maybe go a step further and actually configure the system automatically to federate, if so be the way you design your environment. So automation really opens your abilities to do everything and anything you would want in a cloud type environment. And then the final one to add as the initial set of providers offered by Microsoft is the service bus. Now this one really and truly lives in the world of the developers. It's definitely outside the range of IT pros, and if you're not a friend of Visual Studio, then the service bus is definitely not going to be one of those that you're going to know a whole lot about or probably care a whole lot about. It is also one of the simplest ones to deploy after databases. Service bus simply requires that you have a database server and the service bus application installed. And once you've done that, you can hook it up into the Azure Pack, and from there, it's available for your developers. Now, if we don't care about it too much as IT pros, why would we go to the effort? Well, most developers are looking at some sort of a methodology for going to the public PaaS clouds and starting delivering their applications on that platform. This is important for us on-premise because now we can allow them to do that development on-premise, work through it, and gain all of the benefits that you get from using technology like Service Bus, which is definitely topic for another call. So behind all of these things, we have the actual framework. So we talked about the fact that we have an API sitting on top. That's the same API that we looked at in the previous slide. And that then faces its way up into the actual portals. And those portals, again, one for the administrator and another portal which is designed specifically for our tenants. The portal follows all of the standards, but most importantly, and one of the things to call out, is that we now have the ability for federated identities, Active Directory integration, and the ability to essentially make sure that the accounts that are being utilized can be coming from a federated service. And that is essentially one of the single most important pieces of Fabric that's been added in this environment. When we compare it to the release in January of last year, all identities were stored in the SQL database or on the actual local computer groups, local users and computers for the hosting machine. So this is a major change as we move forward when we now can actually leverage Active Directory federation services and communicate with just about any identity-based system from Facebook through to your own on-site Active Directory. Okay, so we have an idea of what the framework is and what the modules that are sitting under the framework are. But what we're going to do now is we're going to take a little bit of a closer look. We'll take a peek at actually what is happening on each of these modules. So I've just grayed out all of my main modules. And what I'm going to show you now is how we build these things out to give you an idea of what's happening in the back end. So I'm going to start with the websites. And the websites, as you can quite easily see here, it is simply a Windows server. And the Windows Server is utilizing the web farm functionality that is sitting in IIS 8. And on top of that, we have a web controller. Now, this controller is kind of new. This is an extension that was added essentially as part of the Azure Pack. And the web controller's job essentially is so that he can communicate between the web farm controller and the Azure Pack. Now, let's take that same scenario and think about that from the perspective of virtual machines. In virtual machines up to now, you've always had your Windows servers, and on top of Windows servers, you put things like Virtual Machine Manager. Virtual Machine Manager has had its portal that plugs into it. There's been a few different ones over the years. we're changing that, and with the release of Service Pack 1, 2012 Service Pack 1, we got this extra thing called the Service Provider Foundations, SPF. Now this one, essentially, we didn't really care too much about because it is a no data API and it's not really a web interface that we talk or communicate to, but it's been there for a reason, and the reason is the Azure Pack. It allows us to communicate with what happens under the SPF. And really, all it is, it's a bridge. Think about what we do with Active Directory Federation services, and we take HTTP and we convert that basically into Kerberos tokens, do our communications and get our groups and send them back in a HTTP package. If you think about Service Provider Framework doing the exact same thing for PowerShell, and PowerShell in this case specific to things in System Center, then think of it as being a web API that you can call saying, list me all of the clouds. And behind the scenes, it will basically call a PowerShell command to list all the clouds from Virtual Machine Manager, get the results, and send those results back over HTTP. Now, why would we go to that effort? Because HTTP is universal across all of our firewalls, and that means that we can actually do a whole lot of really cool things under the SPF. As we run those PowerShells, they don't have to be direct commands, they can be scripts, they can do things. So not only can they ask questions or set questions, they can do multiple things. And those multiple things might not be just Virtual Machine Manager. It might be a service manager, a configuration manager, an operations manager. So as you start thinking about what it is, it's probably good to know that SPF is documented. It is open, it is extensible. So you can go in, you can look at this, you can see the scripts, but far more importantly, you can add to those scripts, modify them as you require. But like all good things, when new versions come out, you just need to be aware of what changes you've made. Version control, really important. Now, as we scale through this, the same procedure repeats itself. With databases, we can have a Windows Server host currently, so MySQL gets installed or MSSQL. And before you ask, no, there is no support for running MySQL on a Linux host yet under the Azure framework. But we could, of course, deliver a virtual machine which happens to have Linux with MySQL installed on it, but that is not the same. And again, we've faced that up with another API to allow us to communicate to and from our SQL databases. I run the same procedure again when I talk about automation, Windows Server, and I run a runbook service. This is what is known as a service management automation. It is essentially the next iteration of how automation will work, running similar to what was happening in Orchestrator, but this time leveraging the workflow foundations that are built into Windows for the last 5 or 6 years and leveraging the features that exist in PowerShell 3.0. That is essentially the runbook services that are all rolled up, so you can take those, write PowerShell, and like any PowerShell, you have access to every single PowerShell module that's available. So if that happens to come from Cisco, then you can modify networks. If it happens to come from F5, you can play with load balancers. If it happens to come from Microsoft Exchange, you can automate your Exchange mailboxes. This opens up a huge gateway that was restricted in the world of Orchestrator, because in Orchestrator, if you didn't have an integration pack, you still had to fall back and use PowerShell. Now it's integrated directly into the portals, so you don't need to worry about how that works. And finally, following that same methodology, our service bus works in exactly the same way, and allowing us to deliver all of those things up to the service management API, the super glue essentially that gives us each of these areas. Now, what we haven't looked at up to this point is what are those areas called? So websites, virtual machines, databases, automation, and service bus. Together, collectively, those are known as providers. We are providing additional functionality to the API back up to the portals. And we still recall that those portals are replaceable, customizable, or extensible. That portal could, of course, be a PowerShell script, or it could be both. There's nothing stating that I couldn't have multiple portals communicating with a single service management API. Okay, so let's take a closer look at the framework itself, because now we've got a good idea of how the framework looks. We've looked at some of the providers that plug into the framework, but we haven't actually looked at the framework. And if you've read any of the very first things, the framework initially, when it came out, the rumor was you needed 7 machines to run the framework. And everybody kind of looked at each other saying, seriously, why would I want to do that? And pretty much everybody walked away from the framework because essentially Microsoft were pushing this for hosters. And 7 machines came from the theory of scale. I want to be able to run each of the different roles that this framework will do on a different node so I can scale this thing. And of course, I might want to run some instances on multiple nodes. Now, what are those? Well, the first of these are the APIs. And these APIs, as I've already mentioned, are fully publicly documented. You can grab them up on MSDN, and I think Steve is actually pinging those at the moment in the instant messaging window. But these APIs essentially allow us to do multiple types of communication. There are two in this particular case that we're looking at right now. But in honesty, we have three. We have the administrator-only API, we have the tenant backend API, and then of course we have the public API. This is the API that is actually exposed to the users through the actual tenant portal. So everything that the tenant portal does essentially happens through the tenant public API. So it is not uncommon to see something like the tenant portal might be publicly available on the internet, myclouds.mycompany.com, but you might also want to publish the API, mycloudapi.myportal.com, and allow users to use mobile devices to communicate with your cloud services or any other methodology that you decide to use other than the built-in portals. The other two APIs are generally protected inside your firewalls. These are a little bit more restricted because this is, again, think about the administrative role here. It's our job to define what we can do within the actual framework. So the administration and the tenant APIs, the administration specifically is defining what are the different types of services and how we're going to split and define those. And then the tenant API takes those and then splits them into the idea of I'm going to add particular tenants into those APIs and give them specific types of resources and requests. Now, these are documented in really great detail and actually a pretty interesting read, especially at bedtime when you're feeling sleepy, just to figure out what it is that's going in and behind the scenes and what possible potentials you have of using this. Because sometimes when you're working with these portals, you're not really sure, can I really do this? And reading the API document, even though you're not a developer, it'll give you a good insight into understanding, oh, I might actually be able to do this, and then start seeding off a whole line of new changes. And remember, these APIs, these are OData, and OData is exposed and supported in PowerShell. So you can use your regular PowerShell today and connect directly to these APIs and actually call this stuff. So if you can't do it in the portal, you can make a connection to the API and do it from a PowerShell. Now we're back to consistency and repeatability. Now there are two more APIs that have been introduced, and these two didn't really exist in the first version, Windows Azure Services for Windows Server. And these two guys essentially are the new authentication APIs. These guys allow us to now communicate with other places for storing usernames and passwords. And that can be the SQL database that they're all communicating to, or of course it can be the federation services, or it could be extensible. And over time we're going to see other types. So as Microsoft release new versions of the framework, we're sure to see different types of authentication being introduced as more and more people require different types of authentication providers. ADFS, Microsoft Authentication Provider, is the first one, but I'm sure we're going to see a number of other type authentication tokens get natively supported as we move forward. On top of all of that, we can still see in our graphic the tenant portal and the administration portal. So the service management API essentially is a collection of these pieces. Any one of these can be installed on a single node or on multiple nodes. So you can go from one server installing everything, or you may decide that I'm going to put tenant public API and maybe the tenant portal. I'm going to put that on one server and put everything else on a second server, or design as your requirements will. So for a few moments, let's just think a little bit about the flexibility that framework gives us. We can start off, as I suggested, one server holds all the components, or we can take that a step further and we can split that into maybe two sets of servers. One that's publicly facing out to the internet, and one that's sitting inside your firewalls, the stuff that you really don't want too many users hitting, because these guys essentially have the ability to administrate your environment. And where you put these and how you build them, that essentially is up to you. You have the ability to make some decisions about how it works and what it does, and how do you make them available highly. We've talked about this over and over and over for the last 30 minutes. These are HTTP services. You load balance them. These follow standard IIS facilities. There is nothing magic going in. The backend is a SQL database. You can leverage any of the SQL technologies, including things like always on. So you can build this out as simple or as large. And the nice thing about it is that you can move this from one device to another as time goes on. So you build this out initially, you install the framework, and you put it all on one server. You put a few pilot users on it, and you decide this is not bad. I'd like to segregate the stuff. You can add a second server. You can register that server into the database. It does the configuration. So you move forward without having to do a whole lot more other than register the server into the database, and the database now knows more exist. And then you go on the front end load balancer, and you basically will put 2 endpoints against that one BIP. So that is the Azure Pack and the framework and how it's built. We've taken a look at what's happening in the different providers that work into the framework, and essentially how the framework can be distributed from that original theory of needing 7 boxes to demystify that fact and confirm that we can do this on one box, prove it works, and then start scaling out. So let's take a quick look, see is there any questions then, or if you guys have any questions before I jump into the next part of the section where we'll take a closer look at the actual pack itself and some of the magic that's happening behind the scenes. All right, so I think Steve has been definitely covering a lot of this.
Before you continue, Damian, Patrick's just asked a question around the RD gateway.
Oh, trust Patrick to ask one that has to jump the game. Right, okay, so for the benefit of everybody, the first piece is what is the RD gateway? So the RD gateway is remote desktop gateway, introduced with Windows Server 2008, when Microsoft changed from terminal services to remote desktops. And essentially the gateway's job was to, again, convert from RDP, which is TCP 3389, and on newer servers it's also UDP 3389, and make that firewall friendly. So effectively it gets converted to HTTPS. So RD Gateway essentially is another HTTP endpoint, and this time it's converting, instead of like ADFS to Kerberos, it's converting to remote desktop. Now there's a really good question for a reason for Patrick's question, and that is around the provider that is virtual machines. With Windows Server 2012 Release 2, Microsoft have changed Hyper-V for the better, and they are now enabled what they call enhanced session mode. Now really what that simply means is that the old VM consoles that we used to have in Hyper-V, that has now been modified so that it is no longer a VM Connect, but it is actually an RDP endpoint. Now why do we care about that when we talk about portals? We care about that because if I'm delivering a virtual machine to my user and I've used any of Microsoft's previous technologies, I have to deliver the portal through HTTP or HTTPS, and then the user says, I'd like to connect to the console so I can install Linux. Then I need to open up a new port, which I believe was 2339 or something like that. Actually, I know I'm wrong, but it was an odd port that effectively had to go the whole way back to the Hyper-V server. So now I've got this whole exposure problem that my security guys love, essentially saying that I am making a VM Connect from my user's desktop straight to my Hyper-V server so we can see the console. Now that's never going to fly on the internet, and even in an enterprise you're going to have a set of challenges because you're definitely not going to want to have your live production systems available. So you're going to start segregating some of your production clouds to different hosts and start splitting up your host groups. 2012 R2, Microsoft finally made the decision to introduce the RDP endpoint. And as a result of enabling RDP endpoints, they also meant that we now have the ability to use the RD gateway. Now I can talk to these virtual machine consoles, including my Linux machines, through an RDP connection. But because it's coming to the RD gateway, I can do that over HTTP. Now I'm very much firewall friendly and my administrators are kind of happy. And I also can address the fact that I have my production servers that I really wasn't trusting these guys to go near and split off into separate host groups. Now I'm leaving them together because the RD gateway uses a special certificate-based solution to communicate between the gateway and the Hyper-V host so that it can build a trusted connection for that customer or that user, so that he goes SSL from his workstation to the gateway, and then another SSL from the gateway directly to the host to the virtual machine specifically he's been provisioned access to. So that makes sure everything is nice and secure, but far more importantly, it is now firewall friendly. So when Patrick asks, what about the RD gateway? What he's really specifying is, what do we do and where does that fall into the whole idea of using the Azure Pack when we start using virtual machines? So let's take a quick look at what we've got next on the deck, and we'll move over there. So I'm going to split from the deck for about 2 or 3 minutes, and we will just take a look at the high marketing points that we have. Providers and consumers. We've talked about providers and what they do within the environment. And of course, we've got the idea of what's happening between the consumers. So the first thing that we want to do when we look at this environment is look at the actual portal. What do we do and how do we do it? So I'm going to split from the deck, as I said, and I'm going to switch over as far as the actual portals. Now what I'm showing you is an actual portal. For your first view of it, you would be forgiven to think this is Azure, and we know now why. And when I look down the side of this, and unlike Azure, the list is finite. It's not going on down forever as Azure continues adding more services, but I'm seeing just a list of the services or providers that have essentially been made available to me today. Now, behind this idea, I have very clean definitions. If I want to work with something like a SQL Server, it's pretty obvious I need to talk with a SQL Server. The first thing I would want to do is I might want to add a SQL Server that I want to communicate with. So I can group these things or not, as the case may be. So I might decide to group them with SQL servers running 2012, SQL servers running always on, SQL servers running 2008, SQL servers running on slow disk. I build whatever type of groupings and poolings I want. But more importantly, all I need to do is actually install that SQL Server. And once I've installed that SQL Server, I just simply need to provide a name, a username, and password permissions to connect to that instance. So it follows the standard SQL naming and instance configurations, and a username and password privileges to connect to that. And the only other piece that I need to define is how am I going to monitor or manage the capacity? What is the most I will allow the user to consume? So I spin up an instance, and this instance I'm going to say I'm going to give it a disk that will be 100 gig. So once I get to 100 gig, instance is full, we're done. Now, rather than me create this, because sometimes stuff doesn't work, I went ahead and actually created it initially. And what I see after I've added it is essentially the name of the database I've connected and the status and how much disk space that I've just turned around and said that I will allow the user to have. I can then see where we stand in this. So we've still 10 gig free and there's been no database connected. So the other piece that's of interest to me is that this is not set up and highly available, because this is just cheap databases to demonstrate the lab environment. But of course, I could have specific users delivering highly available databases and other users or tenants essentially delivering standard databases. Now it gets interesting, because now I can drill into this particular database and I can see things. I can see how many databases. I can see a graph that will work over a period of time, and I can refresh it. But more importantly, I can see the capacity and stuff utilized. And I can then drill in further and I can see any databases. And it's kind of boring because really there is none. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch. And before I switch, what I'll do is I'll switch over here and I'll show you what we do with these things that we create. So in this particular case, I've registered my database, but I've also registered that we're going to support things like websites. Now behind the websites, I've got my web farm. And my web farm has, if you remember the drawing we looked at a few moments ago, it's got that management connection point. And there's the name of the server that I'm connecting to over HTTPS. And when I drill in and take a closer look at it, I can start to see more details about this web farm. I can see the CPU load that's currently on it. I can see the memory utilization on it. So something we've never had in our portals before. We now get performance details. And you know what's more interesting? I do not have Operations Manager enabled in this environment. So I'm getting this stuff directly through the web portal, through the Azure Pack, without doing anything. So that's a nice cheap win straight away to start figuring out what's going on. I can then take a look and see what's behind those clouds. So in the case of a web server, I can see that I have a fair number of virtual machines existing. And the first one is a machine called the controller, which is the IIS web farm controller. I have a file server. No guesses for what the file server is going to do, but he's going to host the ASP code or the PHP code or the Node.js code that we're actually going to serve from our website. And then, of course, I've got some of the other roles that are responsible to make the farm work. The front end, the management service, the publisher. The publisher is the guy who checks to see have we actually got some content from our users to upload. And that uploading could be coming from a share. It could be coming from a version control repository. It could be coming from an FTP location. And then finally, we've got the guide that has to do all the work, a worker role. Now, these are essentially your IIS servers. So everything above that is kind of once-off infrastructure to support the environment. And you might scale as necessary. You can see in my environment, I'm already running 74%, and the system is sitting essentially idle. It's a small lab. However, I may want to have multiple worker servers, and I may not want them to be of type shared. I might decide that I need to add a new worker, and I'm going to give it the name, and I will call it BDC worker 2. But this type, I want the worker to be reserved. This is going to be dedicated. So when the guy decides to put out a website onto this, he's going to put out a website on a reserved machine. That translates in quite simple English that the website will be the only website. It's reserved for that one site on this machine, which might be a requirement depending on the time of the year or the type of product that's running. But in many cases, you will be able to highlight the fact of doing shared. And in that particular case, it will host multiple websites on that one server. And then the more workers you add that are in shared mode, the more you can share across and scale out your environments. Now, behind that, of course, we need to have a set of websites that are going to run on these. And then if there's anything else that we want to define, what is going to be, for example, the DNS name? So if I think about this for a moment, I've just published a website. I'm going to call it blog.damianflynn.com. But if I look at what's happening in my portal, I'm not really going to get the ability to define blog.damianflynn.com. Instead, I'm going to get to provide one piece of name, which might be my blog. And it will always be at diginerve.net. So when it comes to the point in time that I need to deliver this publicly, I then will be able to test this, and I will see my blog.diginerve.net, and then I can put a public CNAME or an alias or an A record, but preferably a CNAME, against this. So I can have blog.damianflynn.com as a CNAME against my blog.diginerve.net. And it works just like Azure works. It works just like we see in the Amazon world. So effectively, you're now getting to the abilities for actually defining how things are going to happen. Where are we going to put the websites, and what's the certificate we're going to use? So in this particular case, if you were doing this in an enterprise, you might have a default wildcard certificate that you might want for all of your web services. That's good if you're going to be delivering your services as service 1.diginerve, service 2.diginerve, but if it happens to be blog.damianflynn, then that certificate isn't going to really be much good to me, and it's only going to result in errors. So as a tenant, I will have the ability to actually provide my own certificate. That will be dropped on the file server, and the worker roles and the management roles that are part of the web farm, they'll take care of loading that certificate and binding it to the site for me. All nice magic in the background. And the other piece that's kind of nice is that we have the ability to deploy. And we can deploy using things like Web Deploy. We can deploy directly from Visual Studio. We can deploy from Git. We can deploy from any of those different types of technologies, or we can, of course, deploy directly from an FTP. So however we want to deliver or offer shares to that service, or of course we could even share out the actual file server shares. So you have multiple ways of actually exposing your website routes for the users to actually get at. So now that I have defined as an administrator that I have support for farm for websites, and as an administrator I have support for Microsoft SQL servers, then I need to basically start thinking about, I want to offer these to my tenants. And over here I can then define a plan, an offering. So I could do a special offer. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a new plan. And this new plan I'm going to call it Cloud OS. And for this particular plan, I'm going to give you access to websites. I'm going to allow you to have websites from the website cloud, but I'm not going to offer you the ability for SQL servers or MySQL servers. Now notice that I don't even get the offer for virtual machines or anything else like that in here. That's because I haven't enabled those providers. So if they're not enabled, or as in essentially they're not connected to a service provider framework, then you can't offer them. And that goes back to the whole theory of you can add what you need initially and work up from there. It's easy to come back and modify your plans or add add-ons into your plan. And As I've got no add-ons defined, that's all I need to do essentially is to create my new offering. That offering is made private, so it's not going to be offered to anybody. So the first thing I might want to do is I might want to change that offering. And I can click here and say, make that offering public. Now the experience doesn't need any explanations. It's easy to see how this stuff works. And as I finish off here, I'm going to take a look at the plan I already created, and I can see that I have offered a subscription to it. So I'm giving a subscription to that plan, and if I take a look in here, I can see that there is nothing special happening in here. So what subscriptions did I create? Well, I created an account called Demo User. So if I flick over now and I leave the administrator portal and I go onto the end user portal, this is what the end user portal looks like for the very first time. Now think about your first time giving user access to something like App Controller, or even the virtual machine manager interface. They got an UI and then they started bombing you with questions. What do I do? How do I do it? Oh my God, the support was a nightmare. It's gone. With the Azure Pack, the very first time the user logs in, they get a nice welcome. Welcome to the portal. You click next. Here's where the main menu is, and here's what you can do on the menu. You click next. Here's how you create something new, and these are the ones that are available to you right now. You click next. These are some of the commands you can do. These will change depending on what you're working on. You click next. And this is where we tell you if we've had a problem or if we were successfully doing the work you asked us to do. You click done. The training session is done, and the users now are at home. And if I want to deploy a website for the first time, I'll go create a new website. I would like to create maybe from gallery. Let's see, is there anyone in the gallery? And we're going to take a search. And we see what's in the gallery. And the gallery says, oh, you know what? Would you like your website to be using a blog? I would like my website to be using the good old WordPress that we know needs some MySQL backend, and we know that needs. Now he turns around and says, okay, great. What are we going to call it? Now remember, in the administration, I said it was going to be diginerve.net, so it's going to be myblog.diginerve.net. I'll check, make sure nobody else has got that name. And then I'm going to need a database. Now I've got a small problem here. If you noticed, I didn't give the user access to MySQL, and I didn't register MySQL. So I really can't go any further now because I'm kind of stuck. But let's see what happens. Actually, Damian, you're not stuck. You did create a MySQL because you're a genius. So instead, I need to put a name on it. So I'm going to call it my blog database. And the edition, there is only one. Remember, we talked about grouping them when I looked at the databases. And then finally, how am I going to connect to that database? So I'm going to connect as my blog. And I'm going to connect with the word password. And I can't type for the life of me. I'll repeat it. And assuming I got winks, I can hit OK. And now the farm goes away. And something went wrong, so I need to see why. And I got a message that my provisioning failed. And now I get the message back that we couldn't actually create you a database. No, I wasn't as smart as I thought I was because I didn't actually create a MySQL database in the back end. But I don't need to explain to the users what's going on in the background. Now, that said, the user might be developing their own website. So let's go and try this again. This time I'm going to quick create. And it's probably good to note that from the gallery, those gallery items are yours to define. You can use, there's toolkits and wizards available on the internet to allow you design and define your own gallery. So if you have a business app that you run internally, that you might deploy multiple times, if you have a website that you install, you've customized, and then you decide I'm going to package that up a web deploy, you can then post that, package it up, and make it available in the gallery for others to deploy. Now, if I think about that for a moment and I go back to Patrick's original question on virtual machines, and I'll switch back to the deck as I do this. One of the first questions that Patrick asked is about the actual remote desktop gateway. Let's forget about the fact that we've just delivered a website and think for a few minutes that I've delivered something else. I've delivered something like a virtual machine. Then in that particular case, the abilities for delivering from a virtual machine will be very, very similar. And looking at the screenshots that I'm providing you here, everything should be looking and feeling just like you're exposed to. So back in that whole idea of delivering a website, I want to deliver a virtual machine. I can start pulling those virtual machines from a new virtual machine based on a VM template, which happens to be one CPU with one hard disk and it's got such a size. Or I could go back to that theory of a gallery. Now, if I go back to the theory of a gallery, we had this thing back in Virtual Machine Manager, and let me just see if I can actually spin up our connections to Virtual Machine Manager for one moment. In Virtual Machine Manager, we introduced with 2012 the idea of delivering a thing called a service. And a service, in all essences, was this new concept that Microsoft provided us that essentially said that we can have multiple virtual machines connected together to deliver an actual business service. And if I think about what that really means, I could have essentially a virtual machine that was going to be configured with IIS, and on top of IIS, I might have the FTP role created. So we might have one virtual machine, we might have two virtual machines, but we can spin them in and spin them out. But really and truly, you're not going to deploy too many of those things. And really, if you're putting something like an FTP into the cloud and giving that as an offering to the users to deploy in their clouds, they're probably not going to want too many of those things either. I think it's probably safe to say that if you deliver virtual machines to a cloud and your users ask to do a deployment, they're going to turn around and say, I'd like a domain controller. I'd like an Exchange server. I'd like a SharePoint server. And all of those things you really don't want to hear them coming looking for. But now we can do it. So with, again, the introductions introduced in R2, Microsoft have taken exactly that type of technology, and they've allowed us to define these templates, service templates, that if I expand and take a closer look at, in this particular case, I'll go to configure the deployment. And what I'm going to look at here is the ability, test Exchange, to deliver not just an Exchange server, but multiple Exchange servers. So in Exchange, for argument's sake, we have the idea of a CAS role, a hub role, a mailbox role, and in normal circumstances, you might not want to put all those into the one place. Now, if I can do all of that in Virtual Machine Manager, and I have now the ability to deliver Link, SharePoint, SQL, Exchange, all of these big business apps that Microsoft provide, I can deliver those by asking 2 or 3 questions. My Exchange, if you've ever installed Exchange, the very first thing he wants to know that you put out, what are you going to call my Exchange organization? I'm going to call it the Cloud OS. What network am I going to connect to this Exchange environment? I can say my cloud network. What other one do you think I will connect to, sir? And then I can go ahead and I can deploy this. Now, if I spin the whole way back as far as my portal, and I think about the gallery, then wouldn't it be really cool that when the user, instead of looking for web apps, and he was looking for VMs, or virtual machines, or virtual appliances, that he might actually be able to take your business application, your Oracle system, your Exchange server, your SQL server. So when he comes to the point that I'm a new dev and I need a new cloud and I'm writing this add-on for Exchange, the first thing you're going to do is cringe, because you need to resource up the VM, and then you know he has no ability in the world of God to install Exchange. So the next 2 days of your life is going to be destroyed. That's no longer the case. You pick it, you ask 3 or 4 questions that are specific. In this particular case, what is your Exchange organization? And then you let the Azure Pack do the rest. So galleries become your biggest and greatest pal as you start introducing what it is you can and can't do within the environment. And you finally start delivering what is essentially a service. You now moved everything into a service delivery layer. And the important piece behind this is when you start looking at what happens behind the scenes. If you walk away from Azure Pack and you look at what happens in Virtual Machine Manager. Virtual Machine Manager, we saw there in the graphics, has the ability to show you the nodes that are part of that instruction. Virtual Machine Manager, if I swing back for one more moment, has more connections. So let me swing into the Virtual Machine Manager environment, close this one out, delete that for a second, and I go over to my Settings tab. In Virtual Machine Manager, I've got this thing called System Center Settings, and it connects to Operations Manager. And if I look at what's happening in here, my Virtual Machine Manager will actually take those services that I've just designed and deployed, and he'll actually put them into Operations Manager as a service. And if you've installed the management pack for Exchange, or whatever that particular service is, Operations manager will figure that out, and he will start monitoring that service as an Exchange service, production ready or not, as the case may be. So where you move from with the Azure Pack is definitely back into the world of consistency, into the world of the ability to start delivering services with very little process. You do it once and then you walk away. So you go back into your repeatable, consistent fashion. And the really important piece is the galleries that we're seeing here in the Azure Pack. Those galleries will be transportable, not today, but as we move forward into the future, those galleries will be transportable into Azure. So we can take it today from anybody running the Azure Pack, let that be a hoster or yourselves, and you start scaling. So if you think about your websites or your virtual machines, you can start leveraging in the future the ability to stretch your networks and to have 2 nodes of your Exchange environment essentially on-premise. And finally, the reality is we will get to the ability to actually have 2 nodes running on the hoster service because it's Christmas and we need the extra load. If we take all of those things, one of the things in the screenshots, and the only reason I'm showing the screenshots here, is consistency. I want you to see that everything that we're doing here looks and feels the same. The idea of training users to use this is a known issue, and more importantly, training you as an actual administrator to use this is also a non-issue, because you set it up, you do the first connections, and after that, the rest of them are all the same. And the consistency then means that if you think about the user portal and you take in these third-party add-ons, the help desk add-ons, the billing add-ons, and all those sort of things, when they fall in, if you look at what's happening in public Azure today, you'll see simply down the side, this list gets longer and longer. Then I think it's pretty fair to say that the Azure Pack is going to look very, very similar as time moves on. So that kind of covers pretty much all of the bits that I wanted to highlight. The only things behind the scenes that were probably worth spending a few more moments on is a little bit about the resourcing that happens inside the environment. We talked about the fact that we wanted to be consistency. We wanted to understand what's happening, how it works, and what's going on in my environment. But more importantly, I might actually want my users to know this. So originally, when we set up this portal, we had the ability to log in and we could see these graphs start to show up. We can see that on the environment, I can start seeing how many virtual machines have been deployed, and when I swing around, the different types of graphs that exist. Those graphs happen on every portal. Picked a good one, of course. So I try the website once, click into my website cloud. But as users start deploying their virtual machines or their clouds, every one of these has the same look and feel. So they will have their graph specific to what it is they're looking at. They can see the performance. And when we think about things like virtual machines, we can see the performance based on disk I/O. We can see it on memory. We can see it on CPU. Now, I haven't linked up VMs in this demonstration simply because every one that you search for on the internet is going to show you exactly that. They are simply the most common ones that's out there, and I wanted to move from the common to something a little bit different today just to give you an idea of what's happening behind the scenes. But the important message is that it is consistent. What you see here works across, and behind the scenes we have metering going on, and that allows us to take all of that information. And there's one more service that didn't show up in any of the slides I've shown so far. And that service is known as the Service Reporting Service. The Service Reporting Service sits there and he watches everything that's happening in the Azure Pack, and he gathers that data. He picks up the data specific to the tenancy, specific to the subscription, specific to the plan, and then specific to the load that's deployed within that environment. So you can then take that information and you can start putting that through whatever billing and chargeback solutions you want, or you can leverage some of those that have already been delivered for free as part of the Azure Pack. And I believe if you go and grab the web platform installer today, Cloud Cruiser have already got a free sample environment that is fully integrated that will allow you to go in and start billing or providing chargeback information so the users could know what you would charge them should you ever make a decision to do so, which is quite common in enterprises. So guiding the user to say, step back, lads, you're using far too much resources. If I come around to bill you, it's going to be sore. Then you can start dealing with that information. And Cloud Cruiser, again, is one of those parties that are providing the stuff. There will be many, many more, and they will be coexisting. So you can start integrating pricing between Microsoft's on-premise our Azure Pack, the hoster's information, and of course the stuff in Azure. So you can get to a point where you build tenancies that will use single sign-on across all three environments, and as a result, you can possibly do per subscription or per tenant type billing information. So you will start understanding what the resources the users are doing. Now, it's not all lit up today. That's utopia. We're moving towards it and we're moving there fast. But you definitely have a very good starting point to move from. That's pretty much what I've got. So if there is any questions at this point, I definitely invite you to unmute or hit the questions in the IM window. And I hope I've addressed all the questions that were asked so far.
So I've got a really quick question, Damian. It's Steve again. You mentioned it very briefly around being able to download the Cloud Cruiser pack. However, if people want to start going and looking at this, what is the preferred method to actually get this into your environment and start testing it? Is it a usual Microsoft Downloads page download?
That's a very, very good question, Steve, actually. So yeah, I suppose if there's a resolution for 2014, what are you going to do today? What you're going to do today is you're going to install a Windows Server 2012 machine with nothing on it. Seriously, just spin up a VM, go straight out to Microsoft or Bing or whoever your favorite provider is and search for the web platform installer. It's a free download. And when you've downloaded it, it's all of 170 kilobytes. It's absolutely tiny. You open this thing up and within it, you'd search for Azure Pack. In Azure Pack, you will then start to see all of the different modules Microsoft have made available for the pack itself. So if we look carefully, we've got things like Admin API, Tenant API, Admin Sites. So if you were watching through the presentation, those now start to make sense to you where they exist in the environment. The extensions to talk to SQL Server. There's an extension up there I think I passed a moment ago to talk to MySQL Server. There are other extensions down here to talk to things like, I don't know where the hell they are. All right, you get the point. But Cloud Cruiser is actually one of those that has made it to the platform. So essentially, if I want to take things like a service bus and I want to add it to my existing environment, I simply go into the web platform installer, click add. He will check if there are dependencies, and you can see that he needs, okay, the Fabric Controller, SP1. I need Visual C SP1 2012, and I then hit install. He'll ask me, am I sure? I accept the rules, and off I go. That's how hard it is. When the installation is done, you'll be introduced with a little web page, which I'm going to try and open, assuming I haven't messed up my server at this point. Stop. And the web page that you'll be introduced to is a HTTPS site on one, I think, localhost, and he will be listening on port 3101. You're going to get a certificate error because all certificates are self-signed. That's what you get by default when you install, and you will want to customize all of this stuff, but you don't have to. Obviously, as you start learning and making this thing work for the first time, of course, smart ass, you're going to basically be told that your certificates are wrong, your TCP ports are a bit odd, and these are all high ports and odd things. And the idea really is that if you wanted to test this out, you could be testing it on a different machine or an existing machine, so therefore I don't mess with any existing websites. You will want to change these, and there's some really, really good resources out there. Marc Van Elk, new MVP, he's published a lot of good details. There's some stuff up on Petrie, there's good stuff from Fleming Rees, and lots more to keep coming. The best resource we could point you to would be the WIKI, the WAP Wiki that Kevin is typing about. That has pretty much got the videos, it's got the texts, the documentation, and all of the things that you need to look at to get going. But you really don't need to get going. You can start this off yourself, figure out where you're going, and then call on some of these gurus that have spent a huge amount of time working on the Azure Pack, figuring it out, and start customizing it. And when I say customizing it, I really do mean customizing it. Let's go back here for a moment. As I mentioned, the environment is built on self-signed certificates. These are all created by the installer itself. You have nothing to do. You can, of course, change these, put in your own certificates, but if you look at what's happening in IIS, you can see that IIS is nothing other than a set of different websites, and I can check my bindings and I can see these are all running on slightly different ports. I modify these ports and essentially restart IIS. Now, in all cases, you won't just be up and running. You'll need to run essentially a PowerShell command to say, oh, by the way, I changed the port number that the monitoring service was running on. So effectively, you have to tell the Azure Pack that you've moved things around or that you've modified the names that they might be listening on. So you'll start customizing it to be my cloud and so on. But essentially, once you've started playing around with it and you're happy, then you can start going into the customizations. But everything behind the scenes is nothing more than quite simply ASP codes. So load balancing, these are standard websites. Now, one final question I see coming in from Stefan. I'll get that one out of the way there. And if I go back into the platform and I again search for Azure Pack, in the Azure Pack, you can see that there is this thing in the middle, and it's a little bit odd. It is the Portal and API Express. Now, really, the Portal and API Express is the one and all cheat. Instead of actually going through all of the work that we looked at on the different abilities to deploy servers in different places, the API Express basically says, look, it's one server. I assume you want everything. Grand, I'll go and do it. It pretty much does everything the full one does, but it automatically configures, puts in all the links, and honestly what you see in the background and what I've been demonstrating today is actually the API Express, so I can customize it and do the whole lot. So it's a quick start version to get you up and running so that you don't essentially need to go and select every one of the rest of them in it. So if I was on a clean machine and I selected Portal and API Express, and then went into items to be installed, I would effectively see that he's already selected almost all of the rest of them for us. So that's it. I think that covers those questions. Anything else, Steve?
Not from my side. Stefan's obviously had a little bit of a problem when he's been trying it with the MySQL component. I don't think that's going to be a general question we can just cover off without digging a bit more into it. Unless you've experienced it with just purely the MySQL side.
Well, what you'll find is that he won't actually install, just like in my environment here. I've chosen the Express one. I didn't actually install MySQL itself, and as a result, I don't believe I bound MySQL. Let me just go back and just check. Yeah. But what most likely is that there is no connection to a MySQL server. So effectively, you will have installed the role, but you haven't actually connected to a MySQL instance. So I would have to put in a MySQL username and password, and again, just like we did for MS SQL.
Yeah.
What's the largest amount of database?
So the Express edition is more or less giving you the portals and the APIs. You still have to do the configuration in the back end to the non-Microsoft stuff.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Quick question from Maresh: how to quickly do all of these at Home Lab? That is the the Windows Azure Pack Express edition that Damian's just been showing you from the web platform installer.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's 2 or 3 different abilities, but if you want a home lab, the simplest method I would probably suggest is a single virtual machine. Install it as a domain controller if you wish. It's not a requirement. And on that particular machine, then grab the web platform installer, and then as Stefan's question was there a few moments ago, grab the Express version. Where the hell did I put it? I have too many windows open at this point. Grab the Express version from the web platform installer, which now I'm completely lost, and you're good to go. It will do the rest, and then from there you can start actually playing around. If you want to do virtual machines, then you're going to need to install SPF and the virtual machine manager. So it starts getting a bit complicated. So one of the things that you'll see up in P3, I don't believe it's gone live just yet, is that I have taken advantage of the PowerShell deployment toolkit. Completely different topic, but the PowerShell deployment toolkit I've shared on P3 actually has an all-inclusive configuration that will install every part of System Center, with the exception of Data Protection Manager because I don't need it. But it has everything else, and it installs the WAP environment, and then goes and integrates the whole lot. So he hooks up your virtual machine manager, your website, and all of that sort of stuff for you. So that will be showing up pretty soon on the P3 knowledge base. I think later this week or early next week that article is due to go live. So that definitely will help you as well. Now the only scenario here is that needs a total of 18 machines for that deployment. So that's a fully distributed system. But of course, you can modify as you wish.
Yep. One last question focused on WAP cloud service providers. We're going to probably do another session altogether because it's going to take into account things like the MVGR gateway, network virtualization, which I know, Damian, you can talk for hours just on network virtualization.
And I'm just looking at some of the attendees list here. I see one or two names on the list that certainly would be very good working with us. And it's also probably the reason I didn't include virtual machines here, because I knew that if I added them, I would definitely lose concentration and I would start talking about all the really cool stuff that's hitting in there with software-defined networks and stuff. So, I definitely think we will do another session and go back and look at those in much more detail.
I think that's one of the key tendencies around the Windows Azure Pack, and the fact that it is so modular. We've covered the various modules today around websites, service bus, databases, and showed some of them. Service management automation is there. Like you say, then we've got the VM ones, and each component can be enabled as and when it suits your requirements. So yeah, we'll definitely have to do another session just purely around the VM side because it's so huge.
Yeah. And again, remember, it is all ASP.NET, so obviously we're mostly non-developers, but we have deployed websites over the years for our customers, I'm sure. So you will see that customizing all of this stuff is bog standard MVC type configurations, and we have abilities to use things like CSS. So if you want to make a change the look and feel of your environment, essentially you can go in here and you can modify these CSSs. And thankfully Microsoft have actually documented some of the CSS stuff too, so they will give you a guidance. And I believe if you go to download the SDK, there's actually some funky colors like pink and stuff like that you would never ever want to install, provided as a sample too. But obviously everyone for their own and the colors they may buy. I'm sure it was some of the lady engineers that were designing that one.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Damian. There are quite a few links that I have put within the IM chat window with links to things like the various downloads. There's a PowerShell deployment toolkit in there now. There's the web platform installer. There's links to some of the SDKs and the sample kits, references for the APIs. What I'll do is I'll also consolidate all them links and also put them onto the site to be able to have just a brief overview of some of them main contents. And like mentioned, there's some of the guides on there from Marc on the Hyper-V.nu site around changing ports and some of the quick start guides as well. Right, well, I think if there's no more questions, once again, thank you ever so much, Damian, for doing that. I know it's a topic that you love to talk on, and it's always great to hear your thoughts and views and get an insight into just how some of it's strung together. And I think I'll bring the session to a close and say thank you for all the attendees as well. We'll try and make this session available as soon as possible from within the Cloud OS community website. I think everyone's got the various links to that. If not, I'll make it the last link within the chat window. HTTP.
Thank you all. As Steve said, thank you very much for joining us on the Cloud OS, and hopefully we've given you a start for January. And of course, our contact details are available. We're on Twitter, on email, and by all means, hit us up and we'll do what we can to get you going.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Damian.
Thank you.